What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. We're back in the garage working on the Yamaha R7. Today we're going to be replacing the front brake pads and also bleeding the front brakes as well. So we're going to talk about the pads that I went with. We're going to cover a little bit about the different types of pads and the materials that you can go with, some of the pros and cons associated with those, and maybe which one you should pick for your bike and the style of riding that you do. So we'll go ahead and jump right into it, and then at the end we'll have a clip where I'm on the bike and I'll talk about how the brakes feel and kind of my initial thoughts on the pads that I went with. So the pads that we're going to be replacing and putting on the bike today are the EBC Double H Sintered pads. These are probably the most commonly referred to pads when you're talking about brake pad changes or upgrades for these bikes. I'm really not sure off the top of my head what these come with from the factory as far as the type of material, but we'll talk a little bit about that, what sintered means and why you'd want to do it. So essentially sintered just refers to the process of how they make the brake pads, right? So it has to do with the type of materials that they use and heat up to press into the pad or to create the pad. So generally when you're talking about this type of pad, this is going to be a more aggressive pad is the best way to describe it. So a lot of people say that these have more initial bite than the factory pads. So I'll be interested to get on the bike after we swap these out and see if that is really noticeable or not. Because one thing that is kind of contrary to that is generally organic pads and sintered pads are kind of the two big ones that you will see when you're looking for pads for your bike. Organic are kind of the best for just everyday general use. They don't require a lot of heat to get their maximum performance. They work in almost every condition. They're not really harsh on the rotor as far as eating away this material, because that is a factor. So one downside to these that you would maybe consider is that these are a harsher material, so they are going to wear into the rotor faster. But with that, you do get higher performance. So once these get hot, they are going to perform better and have more stopping power than, say, a traditional organic pad. So, you know, this is kind of what I've read about the most for these bikes, so that's what I wanted to go with. You can pick these up at a lot of different places. I'll make sure to include the part number in the description. For the Yamaha R7, it is part number FA252HH. I was actually able to get these at my local Cycle Gear. They had them on the shelf, and these were $47.99, and you do need 2 packages because this is a dual rotor bike in the front, so you need a total of 4 pads. So not too bad of a price in my opinion, although I am used to coming from cars, and typically brakes and parts like that can be a lot more expensive. So we'll go ahead and jump right into the install, and then we'll have a clip towards the end where I'll actually get on the bike and kind of talk about the notice and brake feel and things like that. So let's jump right into it. All right, so the other thing that we're going to be doing today, along with changing the brake pads, is bleeding the brakes. So I'll kind of cover that. It's honestly a pretty easy process. You have a few different places that you can bleed these brakes. So you have a port here up at the master cylinder, and then you will have a bleeder on the top of each caliper where you can bleed each caliper. Now, there is a process technically for how to bleed these. You technically, if you're going to bleed the whole system, say you're doing a flush, you'd want to start with the furthest away from the master cylinder. In this case, I'm not really touching the rear, and it has its own master cylinder, even though I know it's connected to the same ABS module. I'm not trying to flush the whole system. I just want to get any potential air out of there, because I have noticed that it feels a little more squishy than what it may be used to. So I just want to double check that there's no air in there. And the fluid is probably okay, but just visually it looks like it's maybe a little dirty. So kind of my goal is to get enough fluid out of the calipers to get this down some. Yeah, so I really just want to get this down to where, you know, I empty this reservoir, and I may go ahead and just pull all the fluid out of there and replace it with this. So this is what I'm putting in the bike, is the Motul RBF 600. Really any .4 is going to be acceptable if you're not flushing the entire system. If you want to go with a higher rating as far as temperature brake fluid, like a .5 or something like that, you don't want to mix those, so you would want to flush the whole system. But in this case, I'm really just going to be emptying the reservoir, putting fresh fluid in there, and getting any potential air out of the front calipers since I'm doing the pads on the front. So
y'all.
Alrighty, so now that we've got the new brake pads installed, everything's torqued down, make sure to use Loctite on those bolts. I'm sure you'll see that in the video. The next thing we're gonna do is gonna be bleeding the brakes. So I'm only gonna be bleeding the front portion, and kind of my primary goal is just to get the old fluid out of here. It's probably gonna be hard to tell from the video, especially with the back being so bright, but it is a little dirty. This should be pretty, clear. I can tell that the fluid is a little darker looking. That's typically an indication that you might have some moisture that's gotten into the system. And they recommend to, check the fluid or flush it every couple years anyways. So while we're here, we're gonna go ahead and do it. Now, you can do this without a brake bleeding kit, the traditional way. Now, that would be a scenario where it would really help to have another person, but it can be done. I probably personally wouldn't risk doing it by myself without a brake bleeder kit. I would want another person here to make sure you don't let go of the brake and then let air get pulled back into the system, because then you're gonna have a whole mess. And especially since this bike has ABS, it can really be a nightmare if you get air in the system. So I'm gonna be using the brake bleeder kit. You can pick these up from Harbor Freight for like 20 bucks or something like that. You just attach this onto your bleeder, and you do need a compressor. I just have like a little cheap pancake compressor. I use it just for filling tires and stuff, and it's plenty to do this job. So essentially what I'm gonna do is you're gonna put this on the brake bleeder. Before you crack that bleeder loose, you wanna already have it under a vacuum. So we're gonna get it hooked up to the compressor, and we're gonna squeeze the handle, and it's gonna push air through this and out and create a vacuum. So we wanna get all the air that's in this container out and out of the hose. So we want it to already have a vacuum on it. And then from there, since it's a one-man bleeder kit, you don't have to pump the brakes. It's gonna pull fluid. So once you get a vacuum on it, we're gonna crack that bleeder loose on the caliper and let it start to pull fluid down. This does come with a little canister that you can fill with brake fluid, and it has some fittings that can kind of sit in there, and it will self-fill as this drops, because you'll want to be very careful to not let this drop and pull air down into the system, because then you'll get air in the master cylinder and the lines, and then again, a whole nightmare bleeding the system at that point once you get in there, air in there. So given that on the bike, it's really easy for me to watch this while I'm flushing the brake fluid, I'll be able to squeeze this until I see this start to drop, and then I'll just gradually add fluid to this to make sure that it doesn't run empty. So it's a pretty easy process, and having something like a one-man brake bleeder kit just makes it a lot easier. So I'm gonna get that set up and we'll start bleeding the brakes. All right, now that we have the cap off, you can see a little better. It is definitely, it's not the worst I've ever seen, but it's definitely dirty. You know, when you start to see that brown color, that typically means that the fluid's dirty, it's got moisture in it, and it needs to be flushed. I'm not gonna go through the pain of trying to flush the entire system because it's a lot more complex on a bike that has ABS. So I'm gonna get as much out as I can, and that's just gonna have to be good enough, but that fluid is definitely on its way out and due to be replaced. So you'll be able to see the difference once I put the fresh fluid in, what clean brake fluid should look like. So we'll go ahead and get started.
Yeah.
All right, I've reached the point where I'm getting pretty clear fluid coming out of this brake caliper now as well. And by now, at this point, what was in the reservoir is completely flushed. I've already filled it up probably 2 or 3 times. So let the compressor cool off because it was running nonstop to do this. And I'm gonna pull it one more time until it gets down to the bottom in the master cylinder or the reservoir up top. And then I'm gonna top it off and check it and see how the brakes feel, and then we'll go from there. Alrighty, well, we got the new pads installed. The brakes have been flushed. I went through each caliper probably like 2 or 3 times so the reservoir went down to the low and filled it back up. So I got pretty much completely new fluid coming out of both calipers. So I'm gonna call that good enough. It definitely needed to be flushed. I'll put a picture up of the kind of before and after of the color. Definitely was a lot darker than it should be. I'll do the rear at some point when I get some more brake fluid and then decide what I wanna do for a pad on the rear, because I've been reading that some guys actually prefer to keep that as like a stock style organic pad. I'm not sure the exact reasoning behind that, but I really wanted to get the fronts done. They needed to be changed. One of the brake pads actually had a chunk coming off of it. And you know, you do 90% of your braking with the front. So the last thing I'm gonna do is just make sure everything's clean and there's no brake fluid anywhere. And I'm gonna take a Scotch-Brite pad with some brake clean to the rotors to try to get any embedded material off, just real lightly, try to get those cleaned. And then now that it's stopped raining, we're gonna take the bike for a ride and see how it is. But everything so far feels good. The brake doesn't feel squishy or anything like that. So as far as I can tell, we did everything correctly. Real test will be hopping on the bike and see how it feels. So after we get everything cleaned up, we'll do that. All right, well, we are out on the R7. We got the front brake pads installed, cleaned the rotors off, and I didn't record it because it's kind of the same process and it'd be a little repetitive, but after seeing how dirty the fluid was, I did go ahead and flush the rear caliper and bleed that as well. It's the same process. Again, just be careful to not get any air in there. So I ended up having to fill that reservoir probably 3 or 4 times before I started getting clean fluid out and was able to fill it up with fresh fluid. So I will say that I think the pads have more initial bite from the little bit of braking that I did, but it's hard to tell if it's the pads or if it's the fact that I flushed the fluid and bled them, because it's definitely not as squishy on the front brake, and even the rear I didn't think I would notice much because it's just kind of hard to feel, especially if you're wearing like boots, but it's definitely less squishy. So I think there was air in the system. So again, hard to tell if it's the pads or if it was the dirty fluid and a little bit of air in the system, but nonetheless the brakes feel better. So the next step is to bed in the brakes. So I'll kind of speak to that because I'm not going to show the whole thing because it'll be a little boring, but really there's kind of a universal common process for bedding in brakes. And in this case, what most people do, and like someone like Dave Moss tuning, he has a lot of great information and been riding for a really long time. So if he does it this way, then I'm going to say that it's a good way to do it. Kind of the process is to do some different increments of speed and do steady braking pressure. So you're not clamping down as hard as you can, but you want to do steady pressure. So, and you do it in increments of 30 miles an hour, 40 miles an hour, and 50 miles an hour, and you do it 10 times at each speed. And again, it's not mashing on the brakes, it's just a steady, consistent pressure. So if you kind of pull the lever into there, you want to try to keep it at that same lever pressure for every speed. And then after that, you can do a little bit of a higher speed and get on them pretty hard. But the idea with bedding in brakes, for those of you that don't know what that is or what it means, essentially what you're doing is you're trying to get the pad material evenly built up on the rotor, because that material does get bedded in, hence the word bedding in your brake pads. It does get bedded into the rotors, and the reason why you want to do consistent pressure and some decent speeds is because you want to try to get that pad material embedded onto the rotor as evenly as possible. So imagine if it's a completely flat surface and you do some like really jerky braking, or you peak and then let off. Well, those certain spots of the rotor are going to have more material. So it's just a way to increase the performance of the brakes and the longevity so that that material is as even as possible and that you get a consistent brake feel in the future. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and hop on the bike. I'll run a few clips of doing that process, and I'll also probably talk a little bit about how the front pads feel and see what difference I can notice after that, because on the way to get to here I didn't really do much braking at all with the front because I didn't want to unevenly bed the pads in. So I was able to use engine braking and the rear brake for the little bit of stopping I had to do to get here. So let's go ahead and hop on the bike. Let's get the brakes bedded in, and then we'll talk about how they feel and if it's worth doing and if it was a worthwhile upgrade. So Alright, well, we're going to go ahead and start doing the bedding in process for the pads. And you want to just find a good area to do this in so that you're not in stop and go traffic or anything like that. Thankfully, there's a lot of areas around here where it's pretty low traffic, so I can get to the speeds that I need to and have the space to do braking without worrying about people being behind me and whatnot. But gonna go down here and get turned around, and we'll do our first set of bedding. So the first one is going to be at 30 miles an hour consistent pressure, and then you're going to do that 10 times, and then 40 miles an hour 10 times, 50 miles an hour 10 times, and then or just I have to do them now, I guess. 50 miles an hour 10 times, and then after that you should be good. Go ahead and do our first one here, and then I'll be able to get turned in and do it again. So and you don't want to stop and hold the brakes either. You want to do it to where you get down to close to stopped and then let off of the brake, because if you stop, you're going to hold heat and pad material in that one spot. So you want to keep continue moving when you're doing this process. So it is interesting. I was told that these pads will make more noise, and I can definitely hear them grabbing onto the rotor, which is interesting. So something to note. I guess going out at lunchtime wasn't the best idea, because there's a lot more people leaving this place than I was initially planning for. And now I've lost track of how many times I did it. I think 3. Yeah, I will say the definitely feels like they have more initial bite. I know technically, based on the material and how they are made, they theoretically should require more heat to get the peak performance, but they do feel better even at just kind of moderate regular braking. So I'll be curious to kind of get on them pretty good and see. Yeah, they definitely have good initial bite. I keep losing track. I think that was 6 or 7. Not sure. Close enough. I think that was 8 or 9. I'm going to do one more and then go up to 40. And I may need to find a new spot. I was not expecting there to be this much traffic here, although it's not bad, but enough to be annoying. All right, so we're gonna start our next sequence at 40 miles an hour. think this will be our last one, and then we'll go up to 50, and I may find a new spot to do this in. Well, now we've done our bedding in procedure at all 3 speeds. I may have only done 9 on some of them, but I'm not going to worry about that too much because it's kind of difficult to find a good spot to do them consistently back to back to back. So I'm going to call that good enough. And now that we've done that, we can kind of test them out like we normally would. So I'm going to get up to speed and see how they feel, but I will say they do feel like they have definitely more initial bite, and it's, you know, and this is pretty common when referring to like organic pad material, is that a lot of times what you'll notice is that the lever will be more progressive. So, you know, you have to kind of give linear input to the lever to increase the braking power. And that'll still be the case with these, right? Like the harder you pull it, the more pressure it's putting on the piston, or on the pads. But I will say I can tell that these feel like they have a much bigger spot, where on the lever, the stopping power is kind of the same. So I don't want to say it's like an on-off switch, but that's a kind of a better way to describe it when comparing it to the factory pads which were in it. So oh yeah, they definitely require less input to get hard braking. You don't have to pull the lever very much at all. Yeah, I would, all in all, I would say definitely a worthwhile upgrade. If you ride your bike, you know, somewhat aggressively, you like to go in the twisties and stuff, these pads are going to hold up to heat better, and they're definitely going to give you more initial grab and just better stopping power in general. So, well, that's going to be it for today's video. I hope that was helpful and that you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like, subscribe. Helps motivate me to do stuff like this. But Until then, we will see you in the next one.